Good afternoon. Afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all here. I'm Andrew Faig. I teach Native American literature during the fall here and Native American literature and history in the spring. And Native American literature and history in the spring it was just approved by American Institutes to count as any other American history. So you can, if you're a student, you can take that, and that counts towards the same thing as American history would count towards, as it should, and it also counts as English and ethnic studies. So just a little plug there. But we're here to listen to Martin Rizzo Martinez, who's a former Cabrillo student who was inspired by our Native American literature and history class that we hold here every spring to explore and uncover the history of California natives, and especially here in our area, those who found themselves forced to navigate the Santa Cruz mission era, followed by Mexican colonialism, and then the genocidal policies of the United States that intensified with California statehood and the gold rush. As Martin has researched for his book, We Are Not Animals, he's been able to piece together in vibrant detail the lives of Native people here on this land, and the struggle to stay connected through tribal, familial, and kinship networks through these tremendously disruptive times. And in every step of Martin's process, as he's written the book and worked in the community, he's sought to continue to connect Indigenous communities through tribal, familial, and kinship networks. And that arise in conjunction with his teaching at UCSC and his work with California State Parks, creating, guiding, and supporting Native film, art, and literature projects at Mission Santa Cruz, and through his podcast, Challenging Colonialism, which amplifies Indigenous perspectives on issues of concern to Native communities and acts as yet another educational resource. Martin shares what he has and helps however he can. I've experienced the way he builds relationships firsthand as he's spoken to our Native American literature and history classes here and guided students and me toward a deeper understanding of where we live and the rich and diverse cultures and people who have lived here before and after the written word came into being, and whose stories continue to shape our understanding of ourselves, how we relate to the world and one another. So please give a warm welcome to Martin Rizzo Martinez.
I'm gonna bring this down. Andy's a little taller than me. I first want to thank Andy for the wonderful introduction. I want to thank Michelle for organizing this and Cabrillo Library for helping put this on. As Andy said, I was a student here at Cabrillo. Feels like a long time ago, but some 25 years ago myself. And this is where taking classes with Stan Rushworth, where I really started developing the questions that I eventually pursued and became this book and the stories that I'm going to share with you here today. So it's extra special to be here at Cabrillo, to be able to present to Cabrillo students and community here as well. I'm going to start with a bit of a land recognition or a land acknowledgement statement, but not necessarily the canned one. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the significance of the lands that we're on. But we're here, Cabrillo is situated on the lands of historically what was the Aptos tribe. And of course, we still have that name along with some other names like Soquel, who was the name of the chief of the tribe just a little bit further north, the Uipi people. But these lands, the Aptos people were amongst the other Awaswas-speaking Ohlone people who were taken to Mission Santa Cruz starting in 1791. And over the years, though, these lands have become home to other indigenous community members from all over, from throughout California, from throughout Mexico and other places. And I want to acknowledge that too in making a land acknowledgement. There are people like Patrick Orozco and the Pajaro Valley Indian Council who have been working in the lands of Watsonville and Pajaro for many, many years and whose families go back. And there's many, many students, indigenous students, who have come through Cabrillo, who has done a really great job historically of serving indigenous community members, mostly through the teachings of folks like Stan Rushworth and Rob Edwards, both of who are no longer teaching here, but also through people like Andy and Dusty and other people today who continue to do that. So I just want to acknowledge that before we start and recognize how this space has been serving Native people. I also want to start by clarifying that I am a non-Native academic. I am not Native to these lands, and so I'm working in an area where I am not Native to, and I want to acknowledge that. And I also want to point out that my work as a historian is no substitute for listening to indigenous peoples today. And in fact, it is my hope that through the historical work that I do, through the publications, that will encourage people then to go out and to go listen to learn from, and to work in solidarity with Native community members who are out there. That's the intention of my work here. My hope is that my book can help illuminate the historical context in early colonial California to help us better understand it and appreciate the strength, the resiliency, and the ingenuity of indigenous peoples historically and today. And like so many of you here, maybe not everyone, I'm also, again, not Native to these lands, and I think it's really important for all of us, wherever we are, to understand whose histories, whose lands we are on, and to understand those histories and those peoples, and again, to seek to learn from them and work with them. I'm going to share some stories from my book, some specific stories, but I also want to give a little bit of context before we get into that. Let's see how. Here we go. So I want to start by emphasizing that we are at a time right now where there's so much fantastic work coming out from indigenous scholars who are able to kind of tell about the lived realities of their own lives, their own families, and I think that kind of work is so crucial. And so before getting into the work that I've done, the research I've done, I do want to emphasize that and encourage people to go out there and to look for some of these other works. I'll highlight a couple that I think are really important, but keep in mind there's a lot of stuff, and there continues to be more and more great stuff coming out. But for people who are interested in the history of these areas, of the Monterey Bay area in particular, I really can't say enough how important this book here by Deborah Miranda, Bad Indians, a memoir. She is herself native to the Monterey area, and her book is indeed a memoir and a historical work that really gives a firsthand view of this history, and is really crucial. In a similar way, Greg Sarris's book, or multiple books, speak to the histories of the Great Rancheria people just north of San Francisco. And there's all sorts of great stuff like Kutcha Risling, Baldy's book, she's a professor up at Humboldt and native to that area as well. And I'll emphasize this one from a colleague of mine and good friend, Sim Schneider, who is a professor of archaeology up at UC Santa Cruz and himself a member of the Great Rancheria. His book here, Archaeology of Refuge and Recourse, is a really fantastic book that is changing the way that people are thinking about the missions and the limitations and how Native people transcended those spaces. So super important work. In addition to giving some of that context, I also want to talk a little bit about the process of writing the book and the research that I've done. In doing this work, I've worked very closely in collaboration with Native peoples in this area. A couple of them that I want to highlight right here. First of all, this is the Amamutsin Tribal Band chairman, Valentin Lopez. These pictures here, who I've worked very closely with over the years. He also wrote the foreword to my book and has been somebody that I continue to learn with and to work in collaboration with. And this person right here is Ed Ketchum, who is the Amamutsin tribal historian and the great-grandson of Maria Ascension Solorzano, who is the last fluent Mutsun speaker and one of the ancestors of the tribe. Ed is a wealth of knowledge, and throughout this process, I worked very closely with him in back and forth, and anyone reading the book, you'll recognize his name because I quote from him quite a bit as he lended his insights, his thoughts, his perspectives, and was able to really shed a lot of light on certain things, especially when it came to language and oral histories. And I also want to emphasize that right now, the Amah Mutsun in particular are working to protect a space that is called Eurostok, which is one of the historical ceremonial spaces where indigenous peoples from throughout the region would come together for ceremony, and it's right now under threat to become a quarry, turn into a gravel pit. And so there's an active movement right now trying to protect this, and it really is the last of what is known as the Kuksui ceremonial spaces in this area. So it is really important. I want to urge people to visit the website, sign the petition, get involved if you can. Okay, so I want to give that context because Native peoples played such a huge role in helping me to write this and kind of informing this. So my book really details the history of indigenous peoples of the greater Santa Cruz area, from the arrival of Spanish colonials up until about 1900. And one of the themes that runs through my book is that the indigenous peoples of the greater San Francisco Bay Area were interconnected through long-standing ties and interrelationships. In fact, when the Spanish came to California in 1769, what they encountered was a highly sophisticated society that was interwoven through economic, political, social, spiritual ties, and yet the Spanish failed to recognize that, right? The assumptions of the Spanish during the mission era were that people here were living without economy, without a spiritual practice, without sophisticated society. And so there are a lot of these assumptions that they really failed to recognize that. And so part of my work is to recognize this and to kind of point out how complex society was here, and furthermore, how this complexity of society did not disappear through the mission era, despite tremendous losses, tremendous traumas. But Native peoples continued to find ways to make meaning, to understand their world through their own cultural practices, through their own ways of understanding, through their own long histories. And I think that's really important today because, of course, this continues with local indigenous community members who are continuing to do these very things today. One of the things that I focus on too is the ways that Native peoples fought back and the ways that they challenged colonialism. And the story that I'll get into shortly will illustrate that. In fact, it will illustrate not only the ways that people fought back, but the ways people collaborated, learned from each other, and incorporated their own ingenuity in fighting back. And I'll give some examples of that. I worked very closely with indigenous archives. So I mentioned before local contemporary Native peoples that I worked with, but I also worked to find and recognize oral histories in the records. And I worked very closely with the Chancery records, which are the records that the missionaries kept at every mission with baptisms, burials, confirmations, marriages. All of these records, I argue in my book and elsewhere, that they are actually indigenous archives, that even though it was Franciscan missionaries who wrote them by hand, it was Native peoples who told them what to write, who gave them the information, and as such, it contains so much information about kinship relations, about family connections, and when you trace those and look at those, it reveals this vibrant world, indigenous world, that was very much thriving at the time that the Spanish arrived here. I'm going to show you a couple maps here today. This one here was a map that I worked together with Tribal Chairman Lopez and a map maker to make, but we were trying to think about different ways to look at the landscape, look at these areas. Let me go back to the last one real quick because I didn't really mention it. This here is another map that I worked very closely with Ed Ketchum on, and in fact really came out of his work, and I kind of adapted it. But this shows kind of the Monterey Bay area as a whole, and all those little numbers there are approximations of where different village sites were. So I think it gives you a sense of just how diverse the community was here, how many different areas, different tribes, different languages. In the Santa Cruz area, of course, is the Awaswas people. Down here is the Mutsun language-speaking folks, and down here, Rumsen. But you can see many, many different cities, towns, villages, right, throughout these areas. Going back to this one, this map came up when Chairman Lopez suggested that we look at the impact of Mission Santa Cruz. And this is a map that surprisingly has never really been done, but could be done and probably should be done for each mission throughout California. But I think when people think of the missions, at least I did, I tended to think that the impact of the missions, the Native peoples who were taken to that particular area, were impacted in the direct area surrounding Santa Cruz. So that would be the Awaswas-speaking peoples right in this area here of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And that was the case in the very early years of the mission, but due to a combination of terrible conditions and demographic collapse, where people were dying in huge numbers, we'll talk about a little bit, combined with the need for Spanish to have Native peoples doing all of the labor for the Spanish settlements up and down California, there was constantly an influx as in a process that was progressively more violent over the years. Spanish soldiers would go out and bring back Native peoples from further and further away. And what we have here at Santa Cruz is there was about 35 different tribal communities that were impacted by Mission Santa Cruz, about just under 2,500 people total, which is actually one of the smaller missions. But they increasingly were being taken from further and further out until eventually the Yokuts territories out in the San Joaquin Valley. So I think this map helps illustrate that the kind of growing geographical reach and impact devastation of this. I'm going to point out, I pointed out before on the other map, but it might be easier here, but when I'm going to tell the stories today, I'm going to talk about people in three different groups of peoples, basically. The first group is the Awaswas-speaking Ohlone people of the Santa Cruz Mountains in the direct vicinity here. And they were the first people taken to Mission Santa Cruz. Later years, eventually the Mutsun people from basically this area here were taken to Santa Cruz. They became a large number here. They were, of course, split. Many of the tribes were divided between Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista, which is where the Amamutsun traced their ancestry to both, those communities taken to both. And then eventually these are kind of the Yokuts areas, was just beyond the pass over into the San Joaquin Valley. And so the purposes of trying to understand this and think about groups of people, I'll talk today about them in terms of the groups of three. If you read the book, I get much more specific on that. And of course, people were from these very specific communities, such that the Aptos people would not have identified with the OEP and with these other groups, even though they would have recognized that they shared these common connections and relationships. Okay, and so before I get into the specific stories, I want to talk about one more aspect to give a context here, because I think while I'm going to emphasize ways that people survived and fought back, I think it's really important that we also understand the devastating impact and can appreciate just how traumatic these times were for indigenous peoples. This is a chart that I put together in 2015. There was a family from LA, Caroline Ward Holland and her son Kagan Holland, who are from the Tataviam tribe down in LA, San Fernando. And in 2015, the Pope canonized Junipero Serra, and a lot of Native people in California were upset by this. That family in particular, Caroline and Kagan, decided to walk in honor of indigenous ancestors and in protest of the canonization. And they set out for Sonoma. And they walked from Sonoma to San Diego over a 3-month period and had ceremony, invited different tribes in each area to come together and share their stories. It's a really powerful experience. And they asked me, I was in touch with them while they were doing this and met up with them at points, but they asked me to, as they would go to each mission, if I could put together how many people had died at each of these places, how many people were baptized there, and to give them a sense of the impact of those spaces. And this is a chart that I did with that. There's a lot of things we could look at here. if you look here, this is this area. I did it geographically from north to south. But here in Santa Cruz and in San Juan Bautista, the closest one, what you see is that over 90% of the people, Native peoples who were baptized at the mission, died by the time that the mission closed. I used 1835, probably closed 1839 more exactly, but the records get tougher to trace. San Juan Bautista, it was about 85% of the people who died in this. So there's all these arguments about how we should look at the missions these days, and a lot of people who are defending the mission legacies often will say, well, they were not meant to kill people. They were not intended to do that. They were meant to bring people together. But I would argue that if you look at these numbers, and of course it varies in different places for different reasons, but overall it's over 80%. Auschwitz, the number of fatalities were about 85%. So really the overall effect of the missions was on par with extermination camps of World War II. And I think that that's really important that we understand that context, again, so that when we think about the ways that people fought back and challenged these things, they did so within a context of tremendous loss, where people were seeing all of their tribal members with maybe one or two surviving and everyone else dying. And it's really, I think, difficult for us to wrap our heads around that, even when we think of the epidemics that swept through and it impacted them, because that was part of it. And we think of COVID and stuff, right? The numbers are just not on that level of what they endured historically and what contemporary communities continue to grapple with the legacies of. Another way to look at this, I looked at Mission Santa Cruz, and I hear so many stories from Native peoples today about stories of infanticide or difficulty just even raising kids in this environment, historically speaking. And so I wanted to understand what that was like at Mission Santa Cruz. So what I did was I went through and I looked at all of the births, and there was just under 500 Native people, 471 Native people born at Mission Santa Cruz. Again, Mission Santa Cruz is a little smaller than the others. But when I looked to see how old did these children live to be, what I found was devastating, that over half of the children born at Mission Santa Cruz did not survive till past infancy, right, to the age of 1. And it doesn't get a lot better. Over 25% of those who survived, or of the total number, didn't make it to age 5. What that means is over 75% of Native children born at Mission Santa Cruz didn't survive past infancy, up to the age of 5. And I think that this is really important because we hear these arguments over time that the missions brought different good things to Native peoples. And I think when you look at the horrific conditions of people just trying to survive, trying to have families, trying to raise us, again, we're reminded of the tremendous amount of loss and devastation there. I wanted to understand kind of beyond Mission Santa Cruz. So this is a chart I did recently, just about 6 months ago. I was able to put this all together. But I wanted to know, was Mission Santa Cruz an aberration, or was it more in line with the rest of the Bay Area? So I looked at all of the different missions that had Ohlone peoples, which is the Bay Area going down to San Juan Bautista. And what I found was roughly the same, even at some of these missions that were a lot bigger. Santa Clara was the biggest, had over 1,200 people, Native children born there over time. But the numbers are starkly the same. I mean, it's just vary by just a couple percentage points, but the overall impact is about the same when you add the total who don't make it to age of 5. Again, you're right around 75% of the children. So it's pretty consistent. And one thing I should mention is that I wanted to understand too, because I know people will say, well, maybe the infant mortality rates of people before the missions arrived were pretty terrible too, right? What was those numbers? And so what I did was I looked at the data we have from cemetery sites and burial sites throughout the Bay Area, which we actually have thousands of burials that have been excavated over the last 200 years, and the data for that. So I looked at all those numbers, and what I found was it was almost exactly the inverse, that people were surviving before the missions got here, about 80% infant survival rates, with an infant mortality rate of about 20%. So it's almost exactly the opposite, which tells us how those conditions changed so dramatically at that period when the missionaries came here. Okay, so I think that's important to understand, but again, I want to talk today about the stories of resistance of those who did survive and how they fought back and how they challenged that, because I think that's really important for us to really understand and acknowledge the ingenuity and the brilliance of Native peoples historically and today. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to share one of the most infamous stories of the Santa Cruz area, and this one goes back to 1812. The mission was started in 1791, so it was about 20 years after the founding of the mission. The primary padre, there was typically two padres at the mission at any given time, and the main padre at this moment, 1812, was a fellow named Andres Quintana. Now, Andres Quintana was known for being a violent and sadistic person. He was known for administering harsh beatings. He wasn't alone in this, but he was exceptional in it. For example, he had, at the time of the story I'm going to share with you, he had just created a special whip that was fashioned with wire on the tips of it so that it would cut deeper when he would whip people. And in the fall of 1812, Quintana had just recently beat two young men nearly to death. And one of them, Donato, he had called together a group of about 20 men and women from the mission to basically discuss and say, hey, what are we going to do about this padre, right? We can't let him do this. We need to do something. And so before I get into the story itself, I just want to say that a lot of the story comes from, there was an interview with a Native man from Mission Santa Cruz. And this is exceptional for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that there's very few firsthand accounts from Native people who lived during the mission era. And we're really fortunate that one of them was from this area here, Santa Cruz. And this man, Lorenzo Asisara, in 1877, he was interviewed by one of Bancroft's interviewers who was going up and down California, mostly interviewing Californio Mexican community members who had been here a long time. And he interviews Lorenzo specifically about this story. And the story is the assassination of Quintana. I guess I haven't said that yet, but that's what eventually happens to this sadistic priest. And what Lorenzo's father was one of the people involved in this, so he gives this very detailed account. And so what I did in my research was I started from the oral history in his account. I started tracing out who the people were through the baptismal records and started piecing together to understand kind of what the dynamics were, what the context and everything was. So that's, and this forms the bulk of the third chapter of my book. You know, the details of this, you know, really get into it. So let me jump into the story. So Quintana was killed. These men and women basically decided that they're going to assassinate this sadistic padre, and so they come up with a strategy to do that. And what they decide is they're going to. Well, let me jump into the story of one of the people who comes out of this. When I analyze the story, one of the central people in this whole story is a woman whose name was Yakenensat. She's baptized and given the name of Fausta. As all Native peoples at the missions were baptized and renamed, given new names. But as I looked at her story, I found that the further I looked at her, I realized how central she was to this whole story. And even Asisara doesn't quite acknowledge that, although if you really read between the lines and understand what he's talking about, you'll see that. She was a woman from the Sumu tribe, which is this area right here, which is kind of today near Pacheco Pass, Henry Coe Park. And Yakenensat, let me talk about her a little bit. So Yakenensat's the one who comes up with the strategy. When they all meet, she basically suggests to them, she says, look, her husband is one of the former leaders in the mission community, Native peoples, former alcalde, which is kind of these voted Native community members who become the kind of the heads of the community. And as such, they're positioned right in the middle of the mission area. And her husband is a little bit old, maybe he's been sick, it sounds like, so she says, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go tell the padre that my husband is dying, and I'm gonna ask him to come administer last rites on him. And when I do this, what I want you to do is all the young men will come out and they'll surround him and they'll kill him. And that's a strategy that she first suggests. So in this way, right, she's very central to this story. As I looked into the story of Yaquinetza, I found a lot of really interesting things, and this will become apparent as I kind of get into more details here, but she arrives at Mission Santa Cruz 1807, so about 5 years before the assassination is when she first arrived. I could tell from the records she was a leader within the Sumo community, and I should point out that within indigenous communities of the Bay Area, women were often either spiritual or political leaders, right? It was not a patriarchal society, it was very different. And she was one of these people. Some interesting documents I find in one list in 1809 that lists all of the fugitives from the mission. She's actually at the top of a list of women and children who have fled, right? So it's possible she was leading this group out of there. There's a note in one of the baptisms that notes her as being a monja, which is a Spanish word for nun. Now, she's clearly not like a Catholic nun in that sense, but I believe that this is an indication that she's a spiritual leader within her community, that they're acknowledging her status amongst her people, right? And I should note that this is really unique. There's actually only 2 women in all of California baptismal books who are ever noted in the baptismal books as being monjas, as being nuns, and they're both here at Mission Santa Cruz, her and one other person. So it really is rare sometimes for these notes to kind of appear in this. Okay, so really a fascinating figure in and of herself. But back to the story. Again, she plays a central role. She comes up with the strategy, the plan to do this. She's the one who's going to go get him. What ends up happening, so they develop the strategy, they go to do it. She goes, she gets Quintana. He comes, he administers last rites to her husband, Laca Julian. But the men chicken out. They don't do it. So he goes back in. She approaches him again, says, hey, what happened? We got to do this. I'm going to do it again. She again calls him out there. And again, the young men chicken out. They don't do it. And so according to Asesara's story, she says to them, she says, look, if you don't do what you've promised, if you don't come through on your side, I'm going to tell them what's going on here. I'm going to expose the whole thing, right? And so that third time, they finally do. And they kill him. But what's really fascinating is that they end up putting his body back into his room. They cover it up to make it look like it's natural causes that he died of. The Spanish discover it the next day. And that night, see, in the missions, they lock up men and women into dormitories. But that night, they unlock the dormitories and they have a celebration out there. So the whole community is aware of this, right? They know that this has happened. And yet they're able to conceal the details of what happened for somewhere we don't know exactly how long, but about a year or 2 before some soldiers overhear people talking and then people get arrested. But I'll come back to what happens in the aftermath a little later. What I want to shift a little bit and talk about is some interesting things about this. So I told you the story, and keep in mind a couple of the things, the strategy that she came up with, right, to have them come out there. When I was looking through the records and looking at the larger Bay Area, what I saw really kind of helped illuminate ways in which strategies traverse these geographies and different Native communities kind of learn from each other. Up at Mission San Jose was and let's go back a couple years, back 9 years earlier, 1805 is when this happens, 1806. So in 1803-04, there's a padre at Mission San Jose who is kind of cut from a similar cloth as Quintana. This guy is Pedro de la Cueva. And he's also a guy who's known for being violent. Again, these are not the only 2, but they do stand out in this, right? This guy's known for being drunken and getting violent, sometimes even with the other padres, but especially with the Indians. And what happens in January 1805 is that de la Cueva is summoned out to a native village. And they ask him, they say, there's a baptized native person in this village, in the Aserin village, who is dying. And they need him to come out and to perform his baptism, or his last rites. Right? Notice a similarity there. So he is summoned out there, and it turns out that they lead him to a different place. Instead of going to the Aserin village, which would be right here, they bring him out to the Loecha village, where he is ambushed. When they get there, a bunch of native soldiers shoot at them. They actually kill one of the soldiers who's with them, which is notable. It's the first Spanish soldier that's killed by native peoples in the Bay Area during this time. And De La Cueva is actually shot in the eye. He survives, but he kind of holes up in a cave until reinforcements come. They send De La Cueva back to Mexico City shortly after, where other stories come out that he's getting drunk and threatening people with knives down there. Anyway, not a great guy. But what I want you to think about in this is the strategy that's used. So this is, again, Yaquenintzat, right, Fausta, she arrives in Mission Santa Cruz 1805, so she's out here when this is happening, right? She comes later in the year, so it would have just happened a little bit before. She is from the Sumu area right here, and this is happening right up here, about 40, 50 miles north of there. She would have known about this, she would have heard about this, right, for sure. And so you can imagine her 7 years later when she's at the mission dealing again with another sadistic priest and trying to figure out what to do. You could almost imagine her say, well, hey, I have an idea. We might be able to do this, right? But not only that, I want to talk a little bit about why did they use this strategy of last rites, right? So to understand that, we want to think that, first of all, the Spanish colonial process was to, again, as I said at the beginning, to assume that Native peoples didn't have their own traditions of ways of doing things, and so they would impose their way as the right way. But of course, Native peoples have their own traditions about dealing with death and funerals and mortuary practices. For Ohlone people of the Bay Area, the way that they dealt when somebody died, Ohlone peoples were divided into separate clans, right? They were affiliated with certain animals. So for example, anthropologists call these moieties. For example, there would be like Deer Clan and Bear Clan. So when somebody died who was part of Deer Clan, the people of the other clan, Bear Clan, would be responsible for taking care of the body, for setting up the funeral, it would relieve the kin, the direct kin, the family of the person who died from having to deal with that so that they could mourn, right? And as such, it was a ritual of social cohesion that drew people together. It created kinship between different groups, right? Because then they would do the same for the other groups, right? So it was a way that society kind of interwove, right? And they took care of each other and built these types of relationships. So when the Spanish came, and we know that they would have insisted that absolutely they would have seen those practices as being pagan or heathen, right? Which for them meant of the devil or bad, right? And they would have outlawed those, and they would have insisted on doing their own. So again, thinking of both of these cases, the situation, the strategy that evolved, we can see how the strategy was evolved as a reaction to that, right? Where they were possibly thinking, well, we know if we say, hey, this guy's dying, they're going to do whatever they can to do this, and that's going to expose them, that's going to put them where they're not thinking about protecting themselves, right? Something along these lines. It's pretty clear that that would have been something that they were able to kind of, figure out, hey, this is a way to exploit them and get them exposed. And furthermore, it's another way for, in this example here, with Yaquenintzat bringing this in, this is a way that these strategies of resistance, of fighting back, were communicated across geographic lines, across tribal lines, where people would learn from what other people did and find these ways to then find their own ways to challenge and fight back. Okay, let's go back to the aftermath of what happened with Quintana after he's assassinated. So let me point out first that when I looked at all of the people involved, right, a bunch of names come out of the oral histories and then some out of the Spanish documents and testimonials, and when they took account of what happened. I looked at everyone. Of all the tribes, I mentioned before the three different groups, right? The let's go back. The Awaswas Ohlone from the direct area, the Mutsun Ohlone from here, and then the Yokuts people. By 1812, when I looked at the population who was at Mission Santa Cruz at this particular time, what I found was kind of interesting. The people from the direct area, the Waswas, were the minority. They were only 20% of the total, and then the rest was split almost evenly between the Mutsun and the Yokuts peoples. But what's really interesting when I looked at the people involved in the assassination is that all of them, every single one, with the only exception being Yaquenintzat, right? That woman I mentioned a couple times, they were all from the local tribes. In fact, they were all very closely connected through their own kinship. They were all very tied together, which tells us a couple things about that as well. But it's also just interesting, too, how Yakanasa is kind of the one exception to that. So what happens after word gets out that Native people had actually assassinated Quintana? Soldiers rounded up a group of Native men. And that's notable, too, because Yakanasa is not rounded up. In fact, she lives the rest of her life there. She dies in the 1830s, in her 60s, outside of the archives, right? She's never mentioned again, which I would argue is, in a way, her own way of resistance, right? She's living outside of the gaze of the Padres, right? They're not taking note of her. And I think that part of this we can understand is that the Spanish patriarchal worldview, I don't think, this is my theory, but I don't think that they could have imagined Native women being at the heart of this assassination, right? They were only targeting the men for this. So in this weird way, this Spanish patriarchal world and system, in this case, probably in not many cases, but it allowed them to stay outside of the radar, outside of the gaze, and to survive there. But these are the folks who eventually get convicted. I think there's 12 people who are rounded up and marched. They're tied by their thumbs and marched up to Mission San Francisco, Dolores, where they're put through a trial. And eventually 9 of these folks are given sentences. And I kind of list out this here so you can see that, but they're given a variation of years. A couple things to say about this. Of all of these 9 people, only 2 of them survive their sentences. When they're given things like 200 lashes, again, these are not like gentle lashes. These are often killing people, right? And in fact, most of them died. I put their death dates here. A couple of them died even before the sentences are meted out in 1816. So all of these folks died while they're waiting sentence. They're still given sentences, but they're not able to fulfill them, obviously. But most of them die at these different presidios. They're sent out to different places, either San Francisco, San Diego, or Santa Barbara. And I want to talk about more in detail about this person right here, Lino, and shift and tell a couple stories about him. But I want to point this out too. Lino is kind of at the center of, at least with all these men, right? In a similar way that Yakanensat is. But Lino, this is Lino's father right here, Ules Andres, who also is part of this whole thing, who ends up dying as well. And then this is his uncle right here, Fulgencio Serente. And the rest of these folks are all through kinship, through marriage, right? They're all very well connected to this story. And I want to talk a little bit about Lino, but in doing so, I also want to talk about the story of Lino will intersect with the title of my book, We Are Not Animals. So I just want to kind of preface that before we jump into it. So thinking about Lino here, this is a quote from the oral histories, from Asisada's account, where he attributes this whole quote to Lino. So at the time, again, 1812, I started this and I mentioned the terrible infant mortality rates. At this point, in 1812, Lino is 18 years old. He's one of the children who was born at Mission Santa Cruz, and he is the oldest surviving child at that point. Children were born before him, but they died at some point. So at 18 years old, he is seen as kind of the hope for the future, right, for the community, but he's also targeted by the priest, right, by Quintana. And Lino is the personal page of Quintana. He's working side by side with him on a daily basis with his ceremonies, in the rituals, right? And he, like I said, he's the oldest surviving kid, so you can imagine how crucial he is to this community, right? The Spanish records point out how, and it's both in the oral history from native side, but also the Spanish, they even say that Lino is somebody who was castigated much by, castigado mucho is what they say, right? At the hands of Quintana, right? So he's suffered at his hands, he's being targeted for this. And when this conversation, according to Asisada, when this conversation comes up about, what will we do about him? This is Lino's response, right? He says, the first thing we need to do is to keep the Padre from having the desire to punish people in such a manner. for we are not animals. I'll come back to that. He says, he tells us in his sermons that God does not command this type of punishment in his examples and his doctrine. Tell me then, what are we to do with the padre? Run him off. We cannot do, nor can we take him before a judge, since we do not know who commands him to do what he's done to us. It'll be better if we kill the padre without anyone knowing about it, not even the pages or anyone else, only those who are here. Now, of course, other people find out, we know because they let them there, but this is what he's articulating in terms of the reasons. And I think there's a lot of stuff here, and in the book I do try to unpack a lot of this. I think there's some interesting stuff about how Lino, who again is the page and who witnesses this stuff, is able to, he calls him out on this hypocrisy, right? The preachings that he's giving, right? What he's telling people is not consistent with the way he's actually treating people in the abusive way, and all this stuff. But what I really want to focus on right here is this particular quote, because other translations have misquoted or taken it wrong, but literally that's the literal translation of what he is saying there. So in order to really understand what does he mean by this, and I think there's so many layers to it, I want to talk a little bit about the significance of animals for indigenous California, for the Ohlone peoples, but also the significance of animals in Spanish colonial world, and contrast that so that we can really think about what he's saying. So, again, back to this map, but you see here on the side is the names of these different villages up and down this area. In our area here in the Monterey Bay area, in the Mutsun and Waswas languages, the suffix of, let's take a couple of these examples of our area, right? This is where Aptos is, the major village in Aptos is Cayastaca, the one in Santa Cruz is Alintac. They often have this suffix as tak or taka. It appears on a lot of these. And what that translates to mean is, that means a place of. So in the example of the village that's at the mouth of the San Lorenzo in Santa Cruz area, Aulon Tak means, Aulon translates to mean the red abalone, so it's the place of the red abalone. The village in Watsonville is Tiuvta, I forget which number, here it is, which is basically the same thing, right? The Spanish didn't hear the K there, but it's the same suffix. And that means tu is the word, the Mutsun word for the elk, right? The Tule elk, which were abundant in that area. And so it's the place of the elk, right? So on one level, for animals, right, getting back to this question of what do animals mean for indigenous Californians, for Ohlone peoples? Well, they're bound up in the geography, right? The places are named after animals, right? They're named after the environments, after the connection there. Other ways, for Ohlone peoples, animals visited peoples in dreams, right? They brought them power, right? They were spiritual messengers, very much. So there was a spiritual connection with animals that was a huge part of their worlds, right? There was also, I mentioned before the Moedes, right? People were part of clans. They were Bear Clan or Deer Clan or these other animals, right? So they lived in a world where animals were an integral part of this, right? Just as they were bound in reciprocity with other tribal members and communities up and down the area, they were also in these kinds of kinship relationships with animals themselves, right? With the environment. And so again, I think it kind of brings an interesting thing, right? So you can see where, when he's saying we are not animals, right, it's trying to unpack, well, why does he say that? What does he mean by this? But I think to really understand it, then we have to shift in and think, okay, let's think about the Spanish world, right? The Spanish colonial world. What did animals mean? What was the significance of animals for the Spanish? And the differences are really quite profound, right? So when the Spanish arrived here, they brought with them their own plants, right, their foods and everything. They tilled, they took these kind of fields of grasslands and turned them into crops and crop rows at the missions, or I should say they instructed Native peoples to do this, because of course Native peoples did all the labor. But the Spanish world, they also brought with them their own livestock, right, from down in Mexico. So they brought with them pigs and cattle. They brought with them horses. They brought with them chicken, oxen, right? They brought with them farm animals. And I think there's something key in that difference, right? There's a difference between livestock and the relationship that people have to livestock that people do with animals, right, is very different. So some of those things, just to go through them, but they revolve around a relationship of bondage and control, right, with livestock. So for example, when they needed to control oxen, they would put yokes on them, right? They would control their movement, right, the yokes. And they would use goads, which are little prods, right, that they would whip them and then control them. And they would find ways to kind of manage their movement or pen them in, right? And again, I should emphasize that it was Native peoples who were doing this work, right? The missionaries were not doing any of this work. They would instruct them how to do it, and then they would make sure Native people did this and treated animals in this way. And so that relationship to animals would have been really apparent to Lino, right? Where he would have been then dealing with a traditional understanding of relationship to animals that his family would have told him, plus the way he's instructed and told to do this, and probably would have been trying to understand that and grapple with that contradiction and that difference. It would have been forefront in his mind, which we can see in quotes like this. So before kind of bringing this together, one other thing I should bring up is that there continue to be a lot of debates about how we should understand the missions. And some people, Ben Madley, who does great work and is a good friend, he's written stuff arguing that the missions should be seen as the first mass incarceration of California. And there's some interesting points there, but I think when you kind of apply that to it, there's also some limitations where people found ways around these things in ways that doesn't really explain very well. Other people have compared them, even I did earlier, to concentration camps or to slave plantations or things like this. But I would argue that if we really want to understand how did Native peoples of the time understand how they were being treated and the conditions that they were having at the missions, I think it really does come down to this quote. And I think the Native peoples saw themselves as being treated in this kind of dehumanizing way that animals were also being treated. So much like the oxen were being treated with goads, one of the first things that happened in Mission Santa Cruz after the founding of it was they sent away for stocks. And in those letters, the missionaries say, we need stocks here because we cannot control Native people or the Indians without having some kind of stocks to punish them in and to put them out in the public like this, right? They put them there, leave them there as examples. Of course, we've talked a lot about the whippings and this of Quintana and so many others. And again, there's no way that Lino wouldn't have seen these parallels between the ways that they're instructed to treat animals and the ways that they themselves are being instructed on this. There's another story that Asisara relates where he talks about a Native couple who are come to the mission and they're unable to bear children. And he goes into detail about how the Padres forced them to have sex in front of the Padre. They examine their parts, right? And this is, again, reminiscent of what we call animal husbandry, right? Or the emphasis is on making reproduction happen, right, in this very dehumanizing way. And so this is, again, part of what Asisara is relating to this. But again, this parallel between how people are treated. And I should note that in all of Asisara's stories, he talks about some terrible abuses, but he always emphasizes the way people fight back. And in this case, he talks about how the woman scratched the face of the Padre and fought back and was able to kind of, push him away. Although he also talks about how she's forced to carry a wooden doll as a symbol of her infertility, which is this kind of psychological torture that happens at other missions as well. There's cases of this in Southern California, the exact same thing. So it's part of the practice of it. But back to Lino, when he's talking about we are not animals, he is acknowledging and he's recognizing and calling out the dehumanizing treatment that he and the rest of them are suffering at the hands of the missionaries. He is talking about the beatings and the whippings, and he's impacting this is acknowledgement this is not indigenous practice, right? This is very much a Spanish colonial practice that's being imposed upon them. And in this way, it's a rejection of this dehumanizing treatment at the hands of the Spanish colonial Padres. Okay, I'm going to transition from that and just say, I know Andrew mentioned earlier, but if people are interested, the book, this is just out of really one chapter of the book. There's a lot more. It goes much further into about 1900, looking at the Native community in Santa Cruz area, Watsonville. up through like the late 1800s, which there's all sorts of stories there. And I should just add that unlike other studies that are out there, what I really tried to do was center on the stories of individuals and families and how they, found ways to navigate these times. And if people are interested in the work that I was doing, I kind of realized a couple of years ago I was having the opportunity to talk to so many really incredible scholars, either indigenous scholars or allied scholars doing really cool work, or community members and activists. And so I started kind of putting these together into a podcast that covers different themes. You won't find me in the podcast other than introducing. It's really centered on the voices of indigenous peoples themselves. But if people are interested, we cover all sorts of things going into NAGPRA, federal recognition, in most recent episodes. But anyway, thank you all for your time. I'm super happy to answer questions if people have questions. Thank you for listening. And I think that there's a microphone. Okay. Yeah, if people have questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your research. Very valuable. My name is Shirley Flores Munoz, and I teach in women's history here at Cabrillo. I'm most interested in the reduction of equality between Native American men and women at the point of colonization. I'm also interested in the destruction of family systems and values, and I'm also interested in the destruction of spiritual practices. So if I buy your book, will I find examples of that? Is there any notation about women? Thank you. And also, can you put your book on sale at Seacliff store? With a 40% on, yeah.
I don't have a lot of control over where it's for sale, unfortunately. I will say that the paperback version, so the hardcover is priced a lot higher than I would like. There is you could buy it through Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks is selling it at a 40% discount, which is really nice of them. The paperback version is coming out in May next year, and it's gonna be a lot more affordable, which is nice. And the question being, will you find examples of, I think gender is definitely a really important lens to look at this history. And, as you could tell by looking at the story of Yakin, it's not that I related, but I do try to look at that throughout. And I think that, in a nutshell, there is a contrast between, of course, the more egalitarian indigenous society of the time and the Spanish patriarchal world that came there, and there's a conflict there. And I think part of what we see there is that, in this example from that story, I think is an example of ways that some Native women were able to maintain power and influence despite the imposition of patriarchy. But that wasn't always the case, of course, right? And then a lot of women do suffer at this, and I think that unfortunately there are way too many examples of that, and whether that be the sexual violence that's happening or different things. And so I think that's important to document as well. I think I'd like to hope that you would find definitely examples of that in there. But and thank you for your work and teaching that. It's great. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your work and for exploring all this. I was interested in the first demographic chart that you showed, the horrendous rates of death and among the people that were baptized and then died afterwards. Does that include all of the Indians? Are there Indians present here who were not baptized, who were not brought into the Spanish exposure? Just wondering.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Absolutely, and that is, I think, an important framework to think about these numbers. Is that what I'm looking at and documenting right here is only the baptisms and how many of the baptized died within a framework. But you're absolutely right that there were people who Now, some people have looked at this historically and said they baptize everyone, and I don't believe that that's true. I do think that there are small communities that maintain outside there. Even in our Bay Area community here, there are, the folks at Indian Canyon, Anne-Marie Sayers and Canyon Sayers and their family, who themselves were fugitives from Mission San Bautista, right, and ended up there, which is that canyon was an area that people ran away from fugitives. So we have examples, direct examples of that right in our community. So, and then the work I mentioned of Sim Schneider, who's looking at how a family has transcended that, I mean, he would argue that, yeah, in fact, in archaeological sites, that's a failing of contemporary archaeology that only assumes those places were pre-contact, but fails to recognize those places became places where people would go back to, right? Places of refuge to run away from the missions. So yeah, and then there, on top of that, there's also the Native peoples who were killed in the process of taking them to baptize, right? People resisted in many cases, and there's so many that are documented, which then leads to the question of how many were undocumented as well. But there's a lot of people who are documented as, we killed this many heathens because, right, and heathen's a code word for people unbaptized, right? And so they would call them gentiles or neophytos, right? They had these categories of labeling people based on whether or not they were baptized. And so there are a lot of gentiles, they would call them, unbaptized people who died in various ways and situations. So, and that's something that I am trying to explore. Working on an article eventually with Ben Madley, who's done a lot about genocide in California, but we've been talking about looking at the impact of the missions beyond this, right? That this is just the tip of the iceberg, but that losses out of Spanish colonialism were much bigger than this, actually. So yeah, fantastic question. That's important. Thank you.
Hi, I am a student here at Cabrillo, and I'm currently taking Dusty's archaeology class. I already took his cultural anthropology class, and I wanted to talk about what theoretical framework you would apply when looking at historical documentation about this, given that I'm sure most of it isn't very sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans at these missions, and how you try to consolidate trying to understand their point of view with the documentation there is available that doesn't necessarily, I would imagine, care very much for what the effects were on these Native populations.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I'm glad you're taking Dusty's class. Dusty is great. Yeah, so, I mean, that's a complex question. I think you're absolutely right that whenever anyone is doing any kind of historical work or archaeological work or anything along those lines, that is always a big question, right? Is how to understand these archives and these sources and contextualize them, right? How to read against the grain or how to read them critically to look for these. And I think in this case, in any case really, but certainly in colonial California, that's a huge issue, right? So you're right that 95% of the documents we have are the accounts from the Spanish, whether it's the missionaries or the generals or the soldiers. And then there's, of course, once the American era starts, there's all the American official documents that, again, overlook things or ignore them. I think for me, my approach has been to actively center the oral histories and their perspectives. And I think that that's super important in this kind of thing, and especially when there are not that many of these. And that's why the Asasara account is so critical and so important. And a lot of historians over the last 30 years since we've known about this particular document have criticized it or critiqued it and pointing out that when he mentions this, the guy's a 70-year-old, or I guess he's a 60-year-old man at the time, recalling things that happened 50 years ago. And people say, well, the silver currency wasn't, these kind of asinine, really, critiques of that. But I think the importance of oral history is kind of where, to me, what your question centers on. And I'll give you an example, but when I worked with Chairman Lopez Amundsen over the years, I would ask him, hey, when I'm looking through these documents, you want me to look for anything? Is there anything that could be helpful to you? And one of the things he brought up to me was, in their community, there's a story of a massacre at a place called Oristimba, which is kind of out in San Jose area. And they have details about the story, right? The oral history that was handed down had to do with, there was 200 Native people who were slaughtered there. Their bodies were left above ground, not buried. But it's private property now, so the tribe's been trying to get out there, but they can't because it's private property. So this isn't documented, it's not in the records. And so he said, if you ever run across anything like that, well, sure enough, there's a 1930, there's an ethnographer, San Joaquin Valley, named Frank Latta. He eventually comes to Santa Cruz and lives out here. But Latta writes this book called The Handbook of Yoquitz Indians. It's hard to find. I found a copy of it. And in there, sure enough, he interviews in 1930 a Spanish soldier, the grandson of a Spanish soldier who tells the same story. He says, my grandpa was involved in a massacre, and it was over in Oristimba Narrows. There was 200 people. They were left there. The differences are very subtle differences, or there's some interesting little differences, but it's basically the same story. And the guy who tells a lot of the story in 1930, he specifically says, my grandpa was instructed, he was a Spanish soldier, and he was instructed not to share this with anyone because they didn't want it reported. But he told my dad and I because later in life, he was racked with guilt over this, over his involvement. And I think that quote even illustrates to me why oral histories are more important, because oral histories tell the truth, right? They're often reflections of trauma, of difficult things that communities remember, whereas official documentation can be scrubbed of things like that, right? They can be, okay, we're not going to report this, nobody's going to say anything here, we'll just move forward. And so I hope that answers the question. But in my opinion, I think that we have to prioritize those oral histories that survive in communities above written documents instead of the other way around, which is how it's been done for a long time. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Karen Warren. I took Rob Edwards archaeology in 1976, I think. So my question is, these are ostensibly religious organizations you have up here, the missions, and I'm aware that now institutions are looking at making land acknowledgements, and you gave a very interesting background in addition to your land acknowledgement of listening to indigenous people. But I wonder if you may not know about this, but with current religious institutions or others figuring out their land acknowledgements, how much are they going into their own history of complicity and, the reality of their participation in this genocide or whatever?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, let me first say I took Rob Edwards' class too back in, 20-something years ago, but yeah, so I'm sorry for his loss, and rest in peace, Rob. He just passed away 6 months ago or so. But and that was the first class that I ever took where I started learning about Ohlone history and Native history, and he brought people like Patrick Orozco into class, which is phenomenal and important. But yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think that there are some really good questions to be asking about land acknowledgements, and I think on one hand, I think it's great that there is this push in the last couple of years to do that and to have those, but I think there's a danger of those being performative, right? And just being a little box that somebody checks off and not necessarily meaning anything, and that's very easy to do. And I think that the point you bring up is a really important one, is that, institutions with long histories have many ways that they're complicit, and this is with the church, but it's also with the university systems too, right? Being foremost, and of course others. But I think institutions really do have to, if they're honest about wanting to do land acknowledgement, and then it has to be something more meaningful, right? And I think if those are being done without kind of those institutions also doing what they can and learning what they can to do to work with Native communities around there, then again, it's also performative because that's not really doing much. And I think that happens a lot where Native communities are shut out of these things, and then people say, oh, we say a land acknowledgement, as if that's supposed to kind of be a hall pass that they get away with whatever. So yeah, I think that's always an important question, right? And if people, if institutions want to do those, I think it's a whole nother thing too, that you kind of bring up with the church. And yeah, there's some real questions, right? I have my concerns about the way that those mission stories have been told the last 100+ years, the mission myths, but also, do a Google search on, California missions and weddings, and you're going to see thousands and thousands of, these kind of pastoral, beautiful weddings taking place at these places. And if one were to think of that and think like, well, I guess there have been examples in the South of people doing that at plantations, but I think people have stopped doing that to some extent. Put it in that context, but I think that there's a failure in our educational system to address California history in a similar way that really has a long way to go still. So before people start thinking seriously about what those spaces really are and especially what they mean and have meant for Native communities. Which is a complex thing, and I think that it really differs depending on who you talk to and their relationships with those. But again, that to me is probably the most important thing. Is like the more we can understand of how Native peoples view and experience those spaces, I think we have to listen to that. It's super important. Thank you.
Halito, my name is Frankie. I'm in Andrew's Native Literature class, and the numbers up here are they're shocking, they're terrible, but not unexpected. Talking about oral history as a source of information that should actually supersede what is written on the page because of institutional changes being made over time and the suppression of information. My family is removed from Mississippi to Oklahoma and then to California during the work trade policies. And my great aunt is, she's passed a few years now, but she used to talk about losing so many children her age. Like in her friend group, she lost maybe 9 of her friends out of maybe 12 children in the space of a year. And so these kinds of figures are not isolated to the California mission system. But the question that I have, that this is phenomenal, the work that you're doing, in getting these things pulled together, going through these archives and, making those connections. Is there anybody doing this outside of California, outside of the mission system that you're aware of, particularly with regards to the Native schools?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's an interesting question. First of all, there's a lot of really phenomenal work going on by a lot of people. It's really incredible how many different folks are figuring out things. It's really a nice time for that where, I know 10, 20 years ago, there really wasn't a whole lot on certain things. But there's been a lot done recently on the boarding schools in particular. And I was speaking with somebody recently who's back in Minnesota who's been part of the whole movement to literally use LiDAR to find the burial grounds at boarding schools, which is that is a federal process right now, right? There's been, partly because of Native peoples who are in government who are in those positions to do that, but that is a movement that's happening. And we were talking about, what would it take to get that to happen at the missions as well? Because I think there are some commonalities between the missions and boarding schools, but of course, some differences too, and of course, California has its own boarding schools, right? Sherman and Stewart, which is in Nevada, but served a lot of Native Californian people. Anyway, that whole history is, I think, really important, and I'm happy to say that I talked to a lot of people who are doing really great work on that, and there is a lot being done on that. And I think that there's a lot of, I learn a lot from scholars who are doing stuff outside of California, and hopefully they can learn stuff from some of us doing stuff here too. I think that is really important to do that. But I'll say this too, because you make me think of it, thinking about my own time at Cabrillo, and because I know there's a lot of students here, but I just want to emphasize too that there is a lot to be done, right? There's a lot of research to be done. There's so many stories to be found. And like, what I hope that people see with my book is that when I started this, 15, 18 years ago or something, a lot of people told me, well, there's nothing to be found. Like, there's nothing. They just died. That was it. Literally, I had a lot of people telling me that. And I didn't really believe it because I thought, well, that can't be true. And sure enough, there's a ton of stories. So I just think there's a lot more to be done historically in all different fields. And like, you can do it, right? I mean, you're here at Cabrillo, you're studying things. Like, I was there too. I was there 20-something years ago and listening to classes and got inspired to go, hey, and I was living in Santa Cruz. I'd moved here from LA, and I thought, I don't know what's out here in Santa Cruz. I want to find out. And so I just started doing that work. But I think I just want to encourage people and say, hey, there's ways to do that. You have some really phenomenal professors here, like Andy, like Dusty, like Liz, like others here too. And hopefully there'll be more. I mean, I'd love to see a Native Studies program here at Cabrillo kind of continue. But I think that anyway, just to encourage people, but I think that, you can actually, there is a road from being a Cabrillo student to, actually getting involved in a bunch of research and doing stuff. So anyway, that wasn't really exactly your question, but I just thought I'd say that. So thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for being here today and giving us your time. You had mentioned the carceral system that Madeline spoke to, and you made references to slave plantations when you gave the talk today. How would you draw a through line from the encomienda system that I've learned about recently and what was happening with the missions here in the area?
Are you saying the plantation system, just to clarify?
No, I thought you made reference as a parallel with the work that was done here in the missions to slave plantations. Maybe I misheard you, but I'm more interested in the through line between the encomienda system that I've learned about recently and what was happening here in the missions.
Okay, yeah. So, I just wasn't sure if I heard that. The encomienda system, so we're talking about like a Latin American, I think that it really is, California was part of Latin America, right? I mean, I think that is an essential part to understanding this. I think that one has to really to understand California history, one really should understand kind of the history of Spanish colonialism, right? Latin American history, because it is in so many ways informed. I mean, even just to give one example, but like the way the legal system is constructed in California is built on the Spanish legal system versus legal systems in other states back east that are built on English, right? Common law versus anyway, there's all these interesting ways I think legal scholars delve into of how Spanish colonialism shaped things in history in the present in California. Including women's rights to own land, which were more in Latin America than they were in kind of U.S. history, right? And in California, more women had land in the earlier days, partly because of this, as a legacy of that Spanish influence. But in the case of the missions, yeah, there's some similarities and there's some differences. In Latin America, there was a system where the missions, there was always a push and pull between the government and the church, right? Over control over lands, over control over Indians, all this kind of stuff. And the way in a lot of Latin America and most of Mexico, there would be a limitation on how long Indians could be at the mission, and then they were emancipated and they became citizens. And on paper, that was supposed to happen in California. The original intent of the missions was that Indians were supposed to be at the missions for 10 years, and then they were supposed to be citizens. And that didn't happen at all. And 45, 50 years later, eventually, even after the Mexican government gets independence and the church is really destabilized and kind of loses power, the churches in California, the missions in California, held on to their control over Native people. People talk about secularization. Secularization is the term for when the church was disempowered after Spanish independence or Mexican independence, 1821. And so the missions were supposed to lose control with the secularization, but that process was slow to happen, and then the lands were, according to the law of Mexico at the time, the churches were supposed to hand over all of the lands that Native people had worked to the Native people who had worked them. But that didn't happen here. It didn't happen anywhere in California. What happened instead is that they delayed that process and started giving out these lands to the wealthy families, Californio families, and then here in Santa Cruz, that was the Castro family and the Rodriguez family mostly, who ended up with 75% of the land grants in this area, all the Aptos, Rancho, and Soquel. So by the time 1839 rolled around is when Hartnell was the kind of guy checking in on the missions, and he goes from mission to mission to see, have they turned over the lands to Indians? And he finds that no, not anywhere has that happened. And so that forces the hand. 1839 is finally when the missions kind of stop. People are emancipated, and that's the language that's actually used, is emancipation, which is very parallel. And then in Santa Cruz, what happens is there's two communities that form. And again, it's kind of dictated by the different cultures who are here. The remnant Waswas people and their descendants end up on the west side of Santa Cruz, over by Westlake, on the pond up there, Geronimo and his family. And then what's left of the Yokuts people, which is a lot, end up in what they call the Potrero, which is the orchards behind the mission, which is down near Costco area, right behind Mission Santa Cruz. And that area, the west side lands get bought up within 20 years, 15, 20 years after the close of the missions. So the remaining native community from Mission Santa Cruz end up down at the Potrero up until like 1884, about the time when it's basically gentrified and people have bought it all up, and they're left except for a couple of families. But anyway, those are some of the similarities and differences. But yeah, good question. That's, yeah, I think really a big part of understanding all that. So I think the Latin American history is really important to it all.
I looked up your book, and in lieu of an abstract, it had a story. Can you tell us a little bit about why that story was there instead of an abstract, and what's going on in that story?
Which story is that?
It's about a snake.
Oh, in the introduction?
Yeah. It's listed on the publisher's website it says, in lieu of an abstract, here's a story. And it's the snake and
The snake who lived in Santa Cruz Mountains, is that the one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I talk about that in the introduction. To be perfectly honest, I mean, I use it in the introduction to show kind of how I was misreading things, but how I learned better from this guy here. I'm pointing in the wrong direction. From Ed Ketchum, this guy right here. So the story is, and it's a story that was recorded in 1930s by ethnographers from some of the native community members in the Bay, in kind of Monterey, Santa Cruz area. And there's a story that Linda Yamane, who's a Remsen Ohlone woman, really phenomenal basket weaver, who's here today, she's around today. She heard this in the Wax Cylinders, and then she published it into a book called The Snake That, gosh, I'm not going to remember it exactly, but The Snake That was in Santa Cruz Mountains. And it's this really interesting story that Harrington recorded with Ascension Solorzano, Mutsun woman who tells a story, and she would just share some of the stories she knew. And this particular one was about this this giant snake that was in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it's kind of a story about how it's eating up different peoples, and then the tribes kind of all get together, and then they defeat this snake. And when I wrote my dissertation, I talked about the story, I think at the end, and I thought, I just read it, I thought, well, maybe it's an analogy about Spanish colonialism and about people like this. And so when Ed read my dissertation, he sent me back page by page, things I got right, things I got wrong, and it was great. He was really into it. But with that story, he was nah, he's this isn't about the Spanish. He pointed out, he's no, this is an old story. This is way earlier, and so he was I think this is probably about Snake Clan. He's it's probably about a particular, tribe or group that was causing problems, and that they took them out. And so I just included that in the beginning, the story itself, and then the way I misinterpreted it, and then the way that Ed kind of set me straight as an example of just my method of that even though I'm really trying to learn from center things on indigenous perspectives, it's so easy in this colonial world to recenter it on the Spanish and say, oh, it's because of the Spanish, right? And so I'm critiquing that of other people, but yet I can do it myself. And that's kind of why I put that in there to say, hey, it's really easy to do that, but that I'm really trying not to. And by listening to people like Ed and others, that's how I'm trying to make myself accountable and do better on that. But yeah, it's interesting. There are some really amazing stories, and Linda Yamane, if you look her up, she's published these little books. I mean, they're kind of written as like kids' books, but they are like old stories from the area. There's more Rumsen than there are Waswas stories, but that is one that goes back to Santa Cruz, which is pretty awesome that we have any of that still. There's so much lost. But yeah, thanks for the question, yeah. Yeah, I don't know what time we're at. I mean, I'm good too. If people want to ask questions, I think we're probably getting close to 4. But if anyone has other questions, I'm happy to answer always. And I should say too, while we wait for this question, like if people are interested, you can reach me at mrizzo@ucsc.edu. I should have put that on the slide. But if people have questions, you can always email me if you want.
Hi, my name is Jeff DeSerrier, and I'm new instructor in the music department here at Cabrillo. And I was curious if through your work with oral history with these people, are there any stories to share about how music of these cultures was replaced through the missions, and how that can also add to the dehumanization of these people?
Huh. Yeah, are you a music teacher?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's funny, I just had lunch with a colleague of mine who's an ethnomusicologist, or maybe he was explaining to me. He's more of a musicologist who works with indigenous music, I think is how he framed himself. But anyway, that's a question he and I have been talking a lot about and thinking about. But you know, in the missions, the role of the musician or the song leader or the choir, the chorus, but the instruments too, I think is really interesting. And it was one way that Native people within the missions were able to express themselves in one way, but also were able to kind of get status. I mean, they were known for that. In fact, one of the last houses, like properties that was given to a Native person, very few, right? I mentioned a couple of these little areas, but there was a house that was given to this guy, Carlos, who Rayon was his native name, but he was the song leader for the choir. And so he, as song leader, ended up at this house. Now, there's also in 1861 or 66, he has to go to court to defend it, and somebody's trying to take it, and they end up getting it from him shortly after, so he loses that house there. But the fact that the song leader is the one who ends up with the house, he's also friends with Atsisara, is kind of interesting in and of itself. But I think there's a lot of these colonial records that talk about the mission era who talk all the time about the musicians and the music they're playing. And I think that there is something there that is rather interesting. And when you think of the role of music and dance in indigenous communities, of course, right, which had their own instruments and bird whistles and clapper sticks, right, that are made from, elderberries, which relate, the significance of all of the layers of materials that are used is really phenomenal. And a lot of Native community members still know these things and make these things and have these rattles. So that music persists, and there's a lot of Native people today in the Bay Area who are still doing that. The Amah Mutsun are continuing to relearn their ceremonies. They started doing their salmon ceremony over the last couple of years, which is first time since before the missions. We're also seeing salmon come back to the rivers with the removal of dams, so there's something there too. But yeah, I think those are great questions. I think there is some really interesting ways in which music, was influencing controls, but people found it. And I'll just add one other thing to it, is that there's a woman scholar, and she's part of the Tongva LA-based Native community, Eve Chavez. She taught here for a little bit, and now she's in Oklahoma, but her book is coming out sometime next year, I think, but it's about the ways that Native artists in the mission era found ways to express, and she's looking more at like sculpture and paintings and stuff like this, but along the same lines, I think there's some really interesting stuff that can be seen, basketry, right, the ways that people were able to kind of express themselves even in this time. So again, while we think of the context of loss, which is so important, it's also important to remember that people found ways to push back against it and express themselves and express their own creativity, ingenuity, and stuff throughout, which is really important. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, if we have another question, sure, I'm open, but we might be closing too.
This is just a quick one. My name is Don. I'm a student. I noticed a quick mention of Ohlone on the kind of a side note, but on the maps and whatnot, I didn't see anything about the Ohlone. Now, are they a tribe or were they not? I thought they were one of the big local tribes that actually have in-laws that are Ohlone Indian, and they're naming schools and roads. Everything's been happening. I grew up out there, so I'm just kind of curious. I didn't see them unless I missed it, so I'm just curious
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a common one. I think it's important. So the word Ohlone, first of all, the people of the Bay Area, this is kind of Lower Bay, but all the way through here, and then you see this dark line here, but all these areas within this map, and then just a little bit north of here, are what we today consider to be Ohlone people, but at the time, 1700s, there was about 50-ish different independent groups, right? We can also think of them in terms of the 8 Ohlone languages, Awaswas, Mutsun, Chochenyo, and all these, that people think of it today. But at the time, if you were to say, how do people think of themselves? They would have thought of themselves as being Aptos and Oipi, and not being them, even though they're interrelated. The word Ohlone itself is interesting. It probably comes from this community up here, the Ohlone. The first appearance of the word is documented in 1850 after the missions have closed. An American, this guy Alexander, comes through San Francisco and he asks somebody, how do you call yourself? And they say, Ohlone. And so he writes that down. Now, almost certainly, because all of this tribe end up at San Francisco, it's probably somebody who comes from that area. And so that word resurfaces in the 1970s when indigenous communities and anthropologists are going, hey, the Spanish call them Costanoans or Costaños, right, which means coastal people. The American anthropologists start calling them Costanoans, which is, again, just a generic term for meaning coastal people. So in 1970s, at a time of kind of red power, and people are like, hey, we don't want to be called these things, a lot of Bay Area Native people start embracing a term because it's a native term, but today, it depends on who you talk to. The Ama Mutsun, Chairman Lopez, he didn't like the word. He's like, we're not Ohlone, we're Mutsun. That's who we are. Ama means the people of, so Ama Mutsun is the people of Mutsun, which is a place and a language down here, which is where they're from. The Muwekma, they're called the Muwekma Ohlone. The Rumsen or Rumsen, the Costanoan, Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation. So it really depends. Some people still continue to use the term and others don't. But it's interesting. It is an interesting thing. It is a native word. Some people think the linguistic roots might mean westerly because they have a similar root as Olona Way, which is the word of the people, Miwok people in north here, to mean westerly. And this is one of the most western areas, so it's possible it has that root. Anyway, a lot of different angles on it. But yeah, good question. Yeah. Are we good? Okay, yeah, we're at 4 o'clock. Hey, thank you all. Thank you all.